Scotland's remote Highlands are easy to fall in love with from a distance. A house set against a wide glen can look like the perfect escape. But for the people who call places like these home, the landscape is not a postcard. It is where ordinary life has to work. And once you begin asking what it takes to stay here, another question appears. Why did so many places become so sparsely inhabited in the first place? And what does it really take to keep a community alive? To understand what ordinary life has to work really means, it helps to start somewhere specific. On the Knoydart Peninsula, the village of Inverie sits on the Scottish mainland, but it is not connected to the mainland road network. From outside, the practical route in is by sea. That one fact changes the meaning of distance. For a visitor, the ferry can feel like part of the experience, the moment when the journey becomes part of the landscape. For someone living there, the same crossing has a different meaning. It is everyday infrastructure. People depend on it to move in and out. Supplies depend on maritime access too, and when heavier materials need to reach the community, that journey across the water becomes part of the logistics. So even something as ordinary as bringing materials in for a building project begins with a question most people elsewhere rarely have to consider. How does it get here? That is where remoteness stops being only a visual idea. For Inverie, access has stages. People, goods and materials cannot simply be treated as though the water between the community and the wider transport network does not exist. The crossing has to become part of the plan. And distance is only one part of that planning. Severe weather can suspend sailings. That does not mean every storm becomes a crisis, or that Inverie is permanently cut off. It means the connection has conditions. A journey can depend not only on where something needs to go, but on whether the maritime link can operate as expected. For residents and businesses, that changes the rhythm of ordinary logistics. A delivery has to fit the route that brings it across the water. A load of materials has another stage built into its journey. None of this makes life in Inverie impossible. That is not the point. The point is that living here requires a different relationship with access. From a viewpoint, remoteness can appear as empty space, mountains, water, scattered buildings, and long stretches without a major road. From inside a community, it is much more practical. It is a route people depend on, a connection businesses plan around, and a shipment whose journey does not end simply because it has reached the Scottish mainland. The sea is not just part of the view, it is part of the transport system. And once you see that, the word remote begins to carry more weight. It no longer means simply far away. It means ordinary life is shaped by the geography around it. But geography can only take us so far. It can explain why daily life works differently in a place like Inverie. It cannot by itself explain something else the Highland landscape seems to be asking. Why are there so few people across so much of it? The geography around Inverie explains why ordinary life can work differently in a remote place. But it cannot explain everything the Highland landscape seems to show us. Farther into these glens, another question begins to appear. Why is there so little visible settlement across so much land? From a distance, the answer can seem obvious. Mountains rise behind long valleys. Open ground stretches between scattered buildings. Roads narrow, houses become harder to see, and human presence seems small beside the scale of the landscape. It is easy to look at a place like this and assume that emptiness is simply its natural condition, that it has always been this quiet. That assumption becomes harder to hold when the landscape begins to reveal physical traces of the people who were here before. At Croick Church, names and messages remain scratched into panes of an east window. Before we explain why they are there, the marks already tell us something. Someone stood there. Someone had a reason to leave those words behind. That is the important discovery here. Physical traces do not need to tell the entire story before they change the way we see a place. Words left on glass put people back into the picture. What now looks like open ground was not necessarily empty ground. The marks ask us to put ordinary human presence back into the landscape before we even know the story behind them. None of that makes the mountains less dramatic. It makes the human absence more noticeable. But one surviving trace cannot explain every sparsely inhabited Highland glen, or tell us by itself why human presence later diminished. The trace proves presence. It does not yet explain departure. But that is enough to change the question. We are no longer asking only why these places are remote. We are asking how places that once contained human life came to look so empty today. And at Croick, the marks on that window lead directly to the next part of the story. What happened to the people? The marks at Croick Church have a story. In 1845, families from Glen Calvie were cleared from land they had been living and working on. In this particular case, the estate was being reorganized for sheep farming, part of the wider period now remembered as the Highland Clearances. The clearances were not one single event, and they did not unfold in exactly the same way in every glen. That distinction matters. If we turn them into one simple story, we lose the very thing Croick allows us to see clearly: what a change in land use could mean at the scale of a household. At Glen Calvie, the consequence was direct. People lost their homes. Some of those displaced took temporary shelter in Croick churchyard before they moved on. A correspondent from the Times came to the area and recorded what had happened. And on panes of the church's east window, names and messages were scratched into the glass. Those marks are still there. In the previous section, they were evidence that people had once been present in a landscape that can now feel almost empty. Here, they tell us more. They connect a decision about land to the people who had to live with the result. From the perspective of an estate, reorganizing land for larger sheep holdings could be described in terms of agricultural improvement and economic use. For the families leaving Glen Calvie, the same decision had a completely different scale. It meant that the place where work, home, and daily life had been organized was no longer a place they were allowed to remain. That is the human consequence hidden inside a phrase like the clearances. It is easy, nearly 2 centuries later, to encounter the Highlands as a finished landscape, as though the pattern of sparse settlement we see today simply belongs there. Croick interrupts that impression. The mountains did not need to move. The glen did not need to become less beautiful. What changed was the relationship between people and the land beneath them. And once that relationship changed, the map of everyday life changed with it. This one case cannot explain every quiet Highland valley. Communities changed for different reasons at different times, nor should the 19th century clearances be treated as the only force behind all later migration or population decline. But Glen Calvie does establish something the landscape alone cannot. At least some highland absence has a documented human history. Decisions about land use had consequences for the people who lived there. But history can explain only part of this story. The pressures facing people who want to remain in remote Scotland today are different, and the comparison should not be pushed further than the evidence allows. Still, one human question connects past and present. What turns belonging into the ability to stay? That is no longer a question about the 19th century. Today, the system is different. The question of staying is not. On the Isle of Skye, that question can begin with something very basic: a home. Skye has a substantial market in short-term accommodation and second homes. At the same time, local reporting and community evidence have described serious difficulty for some residents and key workers trying to secure housing for ordinary, year-round life. Those facts need to be handled carefully. Short-term accommodation is not the single proven cause of Skye's housing pressures. Property prices, housing supply, and local demand are more complicated than any one explanation. But the human consequence does not require us to simplify the cause. A house can exist on an island without being available to someone who needs to live there all year. That creates a particular kind of tension. A key worker can have every reason to be on Skye and still need a year-round home. That is not an abstract debate about the housing market. It can become a question of whether living near the place that needs their work is practically possible. For a local person hoping to remain, it means that belonging and housing availability are two different things. That is where the idea of staying becomes more demanding. It is not simply a decision someone makes. The place has to make that decision workable. And even securing a home does not settle the whole question. Because for island communities, life also depends on movement. Food has to move. Materials have to move. Livestock may have to move. Businesses depend on goods reaching the island or leaving it at the right time. And much of that movement depends on ferry connections. On CalMac services, delays and cancellations can disrupt freight, livestock movements, and supplies of perishable goods. Not every sailing fails, and not every business experiences disruption in the same way. But when a livelihood depends on something crossing the water, the reliability of that crossing becomes part of the livelihood itself. For a crofter moving livestock, the ferry is not simply transport at the beginning or end of a journey. It is one of the conditions the journey depends on. For a haulier carrying goods, a disruption can mean reorganizing when and how a load moves. For a business waiting for perishable supplies, timing is part of the value of what is being delivered. The ferry terminal, in other words, is not separate from economic life. It is one of the places where economic life can either keep moving or become harder to predict. Taken together, Skye's housing pressure and ferry connectivity show two parts of the same problem. A person needs somewhere to live, and the life built around that home needs reliable enough connections to function. Wanting is emotional. Staying is practical. That does not make Skye representative of every remote community or every ferry disruption identical. It means attachment alone cannot create the conditions required to remain. So the next question is not whether remoteness creates difficulties. It is what people do when geography and infrastructure cannot simply be removed. Do they only adapt their lives to the constraint, or can they adapt the system itself? In Orkney, one answer can sometimes be seen in the air. Mail for the islands is taken to Stromness. From there, electric drones have been used to carry letters and parcels across to Gramsay and Hoy, where Royal Mail staff receive them and continue their normal delivery routes. The need is completely ordinary. People expect their mail to arrive. What is unusual is the way one part of that journey can be completed. The drone does not replace the postal worker, and it does not replace every ferry. It solves one specific link in a chain that becomes more complicated when water lies between the places the service has to connect. That matters because poor weather can interfere with marine transport between the islands. Instead of pretending that weather and geography can be removed from the problem, the route is designed with another option. A letter still has the same destination. A parcel still has to reach a person, but the system that gets it there can change. Adaptation is often described as though it were a personal quality, people being tough enough, patient enough, or resilient enough to live with inconvenience. Here, adaptation is visible in infrastructure. The burden is not placed only on the person waiting for the service. Part of the service itself is redesigned around the place. And that same idea appears in a very different form on the Isle of Eigg. Eigg is not connected to the mainland electricity grid. For most households elsewhere, electricity arrives through a network so large that the system behind the socket can remain almost invisible. On Eigg, the problem has to be organized much closer to home. The island's community electricity system combines hydro, wind, and solar generation with storage and its own distribution network. Together, those elements form a local generation, storage, and distribution system. Eigg has not escaped every energy constraint, and it has not made remoteness disappear. What this system shows is narrower. A basic requirement of modern life, electricity, is being met through infrastructure designed around the island's condition, rather than through a mainland grid connection that does not exist. And the system is not simply equipment sitting on the island. Eigg Electric is community-owned, managed, and maintained. That gives the word adaptation a much more concrete meaning. Someone has to maintain the network. Someone has to manage a system built from several sources. Homes and businesses rely on it as part of ordinary life. Switching on a light is still an ordinary action. What sits behind that action is unusually local. Orkney and Eigg are solving different problems. One is about moving something across water. The other is about generating and distributing power. One can be seen in a drone crossing an island channel. The other in turbines, hydro equipment, solar panels, storage, and the local grid connecting them. What links the two examples is not technology for its own sake. It is the decision to adapt the system to the place. Remote communities are not only places where people absorb constraints. They can also reorganize how ordinary needs are met. Here, adaptation means changing the route or network itself, not only asking people to endure the constraint. That gives communities more ability to shape how daily life works. But this is also where the story needs another limit. A better postal connection solves a postal problem. A locally managed electricity system solves an infrastructure problem. Both can make life more workable. Neither, by itself, tells us whether enough people will remain or whether every other condition of community life will fall into place. So the question becomes larger again. If a community can adapt its systems and gain more control over how daily life works, is that enough to secure its future? After Orkney and Uist, it is tempting to see the direction of the story quite clearly. If communities can redesign systems around the places where they live, then perhaps greater local control is the next step. South Uist makes that conclusion more complicated. Through community ownership, residents gained much greater control over local land and assets. Census data still recorded a decline in South Uist's population between 2011 and 2022. Those facts create the complication. The decline does not show that community ownership failed or caused it, and the census by itself does not tell us why fewer people were recorded there. What it does show is narrower. Greater local control did not automatically produce a demographic reversal. That does not make local control unimportant. Decisions about local land and assets can sit closer to the people who live with them. But agency is not the same thing as a guaranteed outcome. This changes how we should read the word recovery. Gaining control over land and assets does not mean the rest of the story follows automatically. South Uist shows that a community can become stronger in one dimension while another remains under pressure. Ownership can increase agency. On this evidence, it cannot be treated as a demographic cure. And that is an important correction to the story we have been building. In Eigg, adaptation showed that a community can change how an essential system works. In South Uist, the picture becomes broader. Even when people gain more influence over the place itself, community viability still depends on more than a single intervention. That makes the idea of return more complicated too. Renewal cannot simply mean turning a population graph around and rebuilding an earlier version of the community exactly as it once existed. The more useful question is what forms of continuity can be created now. Can a landscape support new work and participation? Can culture remain active through institutions where people study, teach, and work? If demographic reversal is not the only measure of renewal, what else should we be looking for? If demographic reversal is not the only measure of renewal, Dundreggan offers another way to see it. Forest restoration here is not only about what grows back. The work around that restoration also includes employment, education, and a public rewilding centre. That shifts the question from whether the past has returned to what forms of activity and continuity are being created now. A restored landscape can be valuable in ecological terms without telling us much about whether human life around it is becoming more active. At Dundreggan, the restoration also has a human function. People work around it. People learn through it. The landscape becomes a place where restoration is connected to contemporary activity, rather than treated only as an attempt to recreate something that existed before. That does not prove demographic reversal or measurable youth retention. Those are larger claims than the evidence allows. The point is simpler. A landscape undergoing ecological renewal can also become a place around which work, education, and public participation are organized. That is one form of continuity. But a community carries more than its physical landscape. On Skye, Sabhal Mor Ostaig offers another example. The college provides higher education through the medium of Gaelic, alongside year-round academic and administrative activity. Again, the significance is easier to understand when we think about what that means in practice. A language can survive as something remembered. It can be written in an archive. It can appear on a sign. It can be discussed as part of the history of a place. A living institution asks more of it. People study through the language. People teach through it. People work in an organization where Gaelic is part of present-day activity, rather than only a record of the past. One college does not prove reversal of wider Gaelic or demographic pressures. What it does show is that cultural continuity can have infrastructure of its own, education, and year-round institutional activity, through which the language remains part of contemporary life. Dundreggan and Subhal Mór Ostaig are therefore not two versions of the same project. One begins with land, the other with language. One asks, what can grow again in a landscape, and what human activity can develop around that process? The other asks, how cultural knowledge can remain active through education and institution. Neither example proves that the wider challenge of sustaining remote communities has been solved. That would return us to the same mistake South Uist warned against, asking one intervention to demonstrate every form of recovery at once. What these examples show instead is that renewal can be plural. A community does not have to reproduce its past exactly in order to carry something forward. Continuity can be ecological, educational, or cultural. It can create work and participation around resources, knowledge, and institutions that still matter to the place. That is a quieter definition of renewal than simply watching a population number rise. But it may also be a more useful one, because it shifts the question from, has the past returned, to, what is being made possible here now? And once renewal is understood that way, one final question remains. Across access, housing, infrastructure, local control, landscape, and culture, what ultimately keeps a place alive? Look again at the kind of highland landscape we began with. A house in a wide glen, mountains beyond it. Water, distance, and far more open ground than visible human activity. At the beginning, it was easy to ask whether you would want to live somewhere like this. After everything we have seen, that is no longer the most important question. Because the apparent emptiness now carries more meaning. Croick shows that some absence has a human history. Skye shows that staying depends on practical conditions, not attachment alone. Eigg shows that communities can reshape some of those conditions. South Uist shows the limit. Greater control does not automatically produce demographic reversal. Taken together, these places do not offer one formula for keeping a community alive. They show why there probably cannot be one. A community is not sustained by scenery alone, nor is it sustained by attachment alone. It needs conditions that allow attachment to become ordinary life. That can mean access that works, a home available for year-round living, connections that allow livelihoods to function, some ability to shape local systems, and forms of renewal that create work, learning, participation, and cultural continuity in the present. None of those things, by itself, is the answer. What matters is whether enough of them can come together for people to make plans around a place, rather than only feel connected to it. That is what changes when we stop looking at the Highlands as empty scenery. The quiet becomes historical. The distance becomes practical. Adaptation becomes visible. And renewal stops meaning a simple return to the past. Beauty still matters. It is what makes places like these easy to notice and imagine from a distance. Belonging matters more deeply because it connects people to a place through work, memory, family, language, and everyday experience. But the question that determines whether that connection can continue is more demanding. Can it become a life? That is what these places have been pointing toward all along. Not one solution, a condition. Because a place becomes a living community when attachment can become a workable life.